All right, let's take a look now at the stories making headlines today in the papers and online. And we're joined by former senior Australian diplomat and business executive Ian Kemish here in the studio. Ian, good morning.
Morning to you both.
Good morning.
The big story, of course, is what's happening in Gaza. And you've chosen for your first story a piece that's titled "Israel's Move into Gaza Marks a Dangerous New Phase in the War." We don't know what's going to happen, but it is certainly the biggest story in world affairs at the moment, and it poses some difficult questions, I think, for diplomats around the world as well.
Yeah, and look, I think right now there is a natural, immediate media focus on developments in Gaza itself and adjoining Israel, the human anguish and the direct human consequences of all of this naturally sap our attention very strongly. But I do think we need to keep thinking about the broader regional implications of all of this. And the Financial Times, this particular report, helps remind that first there is potential for another front in the West Bank to open up. There have been clashes there over the last couple of weeks. There have been hundreds killed. And then, of course, there has been a steady escalation of exchanges of fire between Israeli forces in the north of the country and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed, much more powerful militant regime militant outfit in Lebanon. That could well lead, and quite quickly, to circumstances a bit like those that we saw back in 2006, where the Australian government, among others, was forced to conduct an evacuation of thousands and thousands of our citizens from Lebanon. Already I noticed that DFAT's warning very clearly against travel to Lebanon and advising people who are contemplating leaving to do so now. So that's something to watch. But look, more broadly, US forces in the region, Syria and Iraq, there's 3,000 plus there, are clearly, we've seen in the last week, vulnerable to attack from, again, Iranian-backed militants in the regime. And there's a broader question of what Tehran itself will do and what the US or Israel may do in relation to Tehran. It's a bit of a powder keg at the moment, and hopefully diplomats will help bring some reason to it.
Yeah, you can only hope, because whilst it's been going on for these last 3 weeks, this latest has been going on for decades, obviously, it's still very early phases in this second phase of the Israel assault. If we could move on to the story in The Guardian, all eyes obviously in the Middle East at the moment, but we know that there is a war raging still in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What is this story here talking about in The Guardian about the largest how Russia has suffered some of the country's biggest casualty rates this year so far? Yeah,
the British Defence Ministry has overnight lent some firm credibility to the Ukrainians' own claims that the Russians may have lost as much as a brigade strength of men in seeking to take the town of Avdiivka in Donetsk region. Now, a brigade can be anything between 1,500 and 8,000 people in the Russian system, but that's a lot of people in seeking to take one town. And look, I think if it had not been for developments in the Middle East, we would have been quite seized of all of this. It's interesting, to say the least, that because our attention is elsewhere, this is almost slipping under the radar right now.
Which Zelensky is very aware of, isn't he?
He really is, and we've seen him make a surprise visit to a NATO meeting in the course of the last week to try and underline the point that this distraction, as he sees it, towards the Middle East, has the potential to undermine international military support for what he continues to regard as a life and death struggle for his nation.
We've been speaking a lot this week about the Australian Prime Minister, who is about to head to Beijing as part of the warming of ties, or at least the defrosting of ties between Australia and China. But there's also news that Joe Biden and President Xi are going to actually get in a room together and at least start the process of having a chat about some of the big issues facing the world.
Yeah, that's right. And look, fresh news from Washington, and it does provide or add to the positive context for our own Prime Minister's visit to Beijing this coming week. trade tensions between the United States and China date right back to the Trump era, when restrictions were placed on the trade in IT products between the two nations. The region, and I mean the Asia Pacific, will greet this latest news that Biden and Xi Jinping are likely to meet in the margins of the APEC meeting in San Francisco with, some relief, I think, because those trade tensions have serious consequences for the countries of the region. Impacts their supply chains. They don't want to be forced to choose between their very significant economic relationships with China on one hand and the investments they're making in the strategic relationship with the United States on the other. So this is some positivity. What it says about what China is learning about its own approach to the world is another interesting question. Perhaps it means that they're beginning to understand the limits of an aggressive, coercive approach on the economy. Here's hoping.
Thawing of relations, it seems. Ian Kemish, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.